setting my timer here. Okay, well, great. Thanks, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I think Brandy may have relayed. Yeah, I had a lot of things come up, but I wish I could have been there. Also, especially for the karaoke, I'm going through withdrawal. I actually haven't been able to go for at least a year at this point. So that was another thing I'm really sorry about. So I was thinking, what sort of things could I say to you folks that are already so well informed about matters? So I think just I'll hit on some themes of things I've been focusing on lately in my own work, and then maybe address what I think a big weakness in like the liberty minded, especially in terms of like a sound money perspective camp is, and what I think the right way to try to respond to that threat is. So big picture, I think the right way to view what's going on right now is that the U.S. has a world empire, and we're watching it collapse before our very eyes. And and to say that is not like a condemnation. Like I think the British Empire. I mean, they literally called it that. So right, you can't mince words with that. That's what it was much more humane than say the Roman Empire. And I think likewise, what I would call the U.S. empire, different U.S. politicians and statesmen and so forth would use different words, but that's, I think, what it, fits the definition, was arguably more humane, more just, more rules-based, to use that cliched term, than the British Empire had been. But nonetheless, that's clearly, what it was. On that note, if you guys haven't seen Dave Smith's recent appearance on Candace Owens' show, I would strongly recommend you do that. I was very pleasantly surprised that for whatever reason, I don't know why, but before I had kind of filed away that I didn't think, she was a heavyweight in terms of, her perspective or her contributions on the scene. And she really brought up some things. She read a speech by Gaddafi that he had given at the UN regarding the Security Council and its historical role that I had never heard before. Like, I didn't even know that speech existed, let alone, did I actually sit there and listen to someone read it off? And he makes a lot of great points about the Security Council, and just like, it's kind of a weird thing that we've got this organization ostensibly devoted to the maintenance of world peace, and yet there's this inner group that can just veto anything. And that's pretty odd. So that's so I think I would encourage you to go watch that. So anyway, I think the big picture is that's starting to collapse. And it's also, I should just emphasize, it's not obvious things like, oh, gee, the U.S. was in Afghanistan for so long, and then as they pulled out in a sort of humiliating way, and the forces that were at bay the whole time just took it over again, and even captured a lot of U.S. military equipment. I mean, there's obvious black eyes in that sense that just kind of are a signal to the world that, yeah, this mighty superpower isn't so strong after all. But even things that aren't so obvious, and here the laundry list of examples from like the last 10 years that I heard, it's from the guy Balaji Srinivasan. I think I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, but he's the guy. He used to work for Coinbase, I think. He recently, the way you probably heard of him, if you're not too familiar with him, is he recently made a kind of over the top bet about Bitcoin hitting $1 million, which I think he did more of a publicity stunt. Like, he was just trying to get people, because he's like a Bitcoin maxi guy. But in any event, that's the guy I'm talking about. If you, again, just as a recommendation, if he's not on your radar, I would strongly encourage, in terms of like somebody who does a lot of podcast appearances that's not in the normal orbit of people, that libertarian types talk about a lot, I would say that guy for sure is my number one recommendation, in terms of like, if you're looking to get somebody new into your podcast rotation and who should you listen to, that guy's perspective. I just listened to one 3-hour interview he gave. I listened to it like a month ago. I think he gave it about 6 months ago. And he had about 8 different trains of thought that I thought were fascinating, and I haven't heard anybody from like our camp really emphasize. But anyway, one train of thought that he went through for like 15 minutes is he just started listing all of these recent historical examples from, let's say, maybe going back 10 years, but it's more like in the last 5 or 6, as I recall, where the U.S. government, clearly let some other foreign government know, hey, you're about to do X, Y, Z. We would prefer that you didn't do it that way. We want you to do this instead. And that government just didn't listen to them. And it's not like, the Marines went in. It's not like the U.S. imposed sanctions on them. It kind of just moved along like, nothing happened. And that episode never occurred. And so Balaji's point is that that's happening more and more. And he argues, I think convincingly, that 20 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. 20 years ago, if the U.S. government, officially, like in the sense, like the fact that Balaji knows these events happen means, it wasn't behind the scenes through diplomatic channels. It was out in the open where U.S. officials made it clear we don't agree with, this particular government stance on some issue. And before, the governments usually would have come around to what the U.S.'s point of view was, either because the U.S. could bribe them into it or because ultimately it was backed up by, military threat from the U.S. and its allies. And Balaji's point is just more and more that's not happening. And it's not merely, the countries that are openly hostile to the U.S., but just ones that his point was, it's just that foreign governments now more and more, when they're deciding what do we want to do in terms of our policies, the preferences or the opinion of what does the U.S. government think about this issue isn't a big deal anymore to them. Whereas before it was a much bigger deal. And the fact that now more and more governments can get away with ignoring what the U.S. says, that's his point, being that everyone's kind of observing that and realizing, okay, things are slowly changing. And everybody's being real slick about it and real low key so as not to draw attention to it, right? That is like the big guy, I'm not even going to use the term bully because that's a loaded term, but that's not my point here. I'm just saying clearly there was this force that was the dominant superpower and its power is eroding. Its influence on world events, its ability to control and steer things is slipping. And the various other parties know that that's happening. And so they're not drawing attention to it because why would they? It's just everyone kind of realizes that's what's going on, even as the U.S. government continues to pontificate and mostly puts on a show for the domestic population for them to still think that, oh, yeah, we're number one, we rule the world, when clearly that's not happening. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture. Now, let me just switch over to some more narrowly focused economic issues because that's kind of my, that's my area. I recently was on a zero hedge debate with Jim Rickards was like on my side, and we had Brent Johnson and Michael Every were on the other side, and we were debating the fate of the U.S. dollar. So this, of course, is all intertwined with my thesis here. And what we were arguing is that so just to give you a little of the backstory, the original proposition was that we were banding about was to say that the U.S. dollar would no longer be the global reserve currency by the year 2040. And I was very comfortable saying that. In the back and forth over email, people were concerned that, well, that's so far out in the future, it's not going to intrigue people. It's not going to be as compelling. What if we pull up to 2030? And so I said, okay, but I'm going to add the caveat. I'm not saying there's going to exist another single currency that is clearly, more relevant than the US dollar by the year 2030. But I'm saying the way how right now people say, yeah, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, that won't be, as obvious a statement by 2030. So that that was the caveat I gave, that it's clearly slipping. And so, just standard, I won't rattle off statistics here, but just in terms of standard statistics, it already has shed several percentage points just from the year 2000 in terms of like global reserve currencies held by central banks around the world, for example. That's just one metric that central banks, when they want to have different currencies to maintain or bolster their own currency, obviously they have a lot in U.S. treasuries. And that has slipped over time steadily, such that if that trend just continues, then yeah, about like, I think it's like 2038 or something, the US dollar will be below the 50% mark. Okay, so that's not involving an acceleration. That's just literally the trend since 2000, if you just extrapolate forward. Let me just give you another example of the kind of thing I mean that is not trumpeted around US media. Depending on how you measure it, the Chinese economy has already surpassed the US's back in 2016 was when the switchover occurred. And the specific, the reason there's ambiguity there is it depends on how do you compare the US dollar with the Chinese currency, right? So because like Chinese GDP is measured in yuan, their currency, and obviously US GDP is measured in dollars. So to say which economy is bigger, assuming those underlying numbers make sense or a ballpark or at least a first approximation, how do you compare those two different units? And so you got to know what, well, if you look at the foreign currency exchange rate, right? Like when people, when currency traders are trading dollars for yuan, what's the market rate there? If you use that, then yes, the US economy is still a lot bigger than the Chinese. But most economists, when they're doing cross country comparisons, think that's not the best way to really isolate, like, the standard of living of people in China versus the US, that kind of, or how much total stuff is produced in China versus the US, using that exchange, just the market exchange rate. Because, like, for example, a lot of things can't be exported, right? Like haircuts and massages and stuff like that, car wash services. There's not like an arbitrage opportunity where, oh, clearly if it was underpriced in one country, they would just buy it up there and ship it across the ocean the other one, the way you could do with like barrels of oil or something, right? So another way of trying to gauge, if you're looking at two economies that are priced in different currencies, how do you figure out which one's bigger than the other one, is to look at what's called purchasing power parity, or PPP. And there, the idea is you say, okay, like, if you wanted to buy a basket of goods and services in the US, like a haircut and some apples and some meat and so forth, and some electricity, blah, 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 how much would that cost you in dollars? And then the same basket in China, how many yuan would you need? And then you just, divide those two. And that's a different way to say what's the strength of the dollar versus yuan. And if you do it that way, then, like I said, the Chinese economy is already bigger than the US. In fact, it surpassed it back in 2016, and it's growing at a faster rate typically. Okay, so the various, you probably heard the term the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So the BRICs, not South Africa so much. Those, their economies are a large portion already, like a third of the global economy. But beyond that is, if you go look at their gold stockpiles, they have all been incredibly increasing their holdings of gold over, like, in the last 20 years, let's say. All right. So it's, again, I think what we're seeing before, unfolding before our eyes, and it's just kind of happening almost so gradually that you just don't notice it. But when you step back and look at the statistics over a longer stretch, it's clearly there's different blocks emerging in the globe, with one coalition of the US and its allies and another one in its. Okay. So all right. So those are two of the trends. Also, just as an aside, that little digression I went on there, that tangent about, PPP and so forth. You know who else recently dropped that in an interview that I was surprised to see? Was Vladimir Putin talking to Tucker Carlson. He was, I don't know how many of you guys watched that. I didn't watch the whole thing. I just watched like an hour of it just to kind of get a sense of the flow. And Putin's sitting there talking, obviously they're translating it. And he just kind of made an offhand remark saying, yes, the Chinese economy is already surpassing that of the United States, at least using the PPP metric. Okay, so I haven't watched Biden closely, but I haven't ever heard him make that distinction when he's talking about, GDPs of different countries around the world in that particular metric, right? So again, just kind of showing, I think even though libertarians are a lot more cosmopolitan and, globally minded than other political parties, obviously, still, I think even us being in the United States, we have these blinders on, and we don't realize just how ludicrous, our political officials stack up compared to people around the world, just in terms of their competence and so forth. Okay, so that's, the main arguments in terms of just various things. Another one, just a quick another one. Right now, the U.S. government is spending more on interest payments on the federal debt than it spends on the military. Okay, so these were always things. I know I'm just looking around. I think I'm older than most of you in this room. Maybe not all of you, but most of us. And I've been in this kind of stuff since I was a teenager in high school, and these types of things were always looming threats, right? These were always things that, oh, hey, if the Congress doesn't get its fiscal house in order, eventually, Social Security is going to be paying out more in benefits than it takes in taxes from, contributions from workers in terms of payroll taxes, unless we reform entitlements. That already happened, right? I think that happened during the financial crisis. It may have flipped again, but then it went back again during COVID. Okay, again, just meaning that in terms of the Social Security accounting, that at this point they don't take in each year enough from workers to pay the outgoing benefits. And so they're whittling down, what's called the Social Security Trust Fund, whatever you think of the validity of that thing, that they're already in that phase. So I'm just saying a lot of these things, and again, another one was the one I just said 2 minutes ago. It was always shown in these projections that, hey, if the Congress doesn't stop borrowing so much money, at some point the interest on the debt is going to be the biggest expenditure. It's going to be bigger than the military spending. And that was all, that was just like insane that could ever be the case. And that's where we are. And it's not because they cut the military's budget so much, right? They're both enormous numbers. And the other thing too is with this, it's not because of some one-off emergency, right? It like during the financial crisis of 2008, yeah, the government ran some big budget deficits. When Obama came in, there were 4 years in a row where the federal budget deficit was higher than $1 trillion each year for 4 straight years. And that was insane, but you could at least, say, like, again, like a normal kind of person, not somebody who's really ideological, might just dismiss that and say, well, yeah, but there was since the Great Depression, that was the worst financial crisis. It makes sense the government would borrow that much, but now we're getting back to normal. And I'm saying that, no, that like the latest CBO report, that's Congressional Budget Office, and they kind of just, take their, believe it or not, I think they're actually pretty fair-minded. Like people at the CBO, I don't know if with the current people running it, but in the past, like they've emailed me to say, hey, on this area, I knew a lot on like carbon tax stuff. That was one of my specialties. And they actually emailed me to say, we're doing a section on that. Do you have any reading you want us to look at to make sure we cover all the perspectives, different schools of thought on this stuff. So I'm just saying they try to be even-handed and just like give the political officials a framework to say, based on your policy decisions, this is what the debt looks like 10 years from now, depending if you go down path A, B, or C. So I'm just saying, using that scorecard, this stuff, if you've seen charts of it, it just, the federal debt just keeps mushrooming. It's not like it was a one-off thing because of the financial crisis and then COVID. It's just at this point, because part of what happened is the huge debts they ran up in the wake of 2008 and then after COVID, we didn't feel the full impact of it in terms of the shock on the budget because interest rates were so low. But now that interest rates are just gradually moving up back towards a normal range, that's all going out the window. Okay, so that's part of what the prognosis here. So in the few minutes here left, and then I'll open up to your guys' questions. I'm happy to do that. I know you wanted, Brandy was saying maybe 15 minutes or so. So I think the one sort of chink in our armor, if you will, is this MMT stuff, the modern monetary theory. So let me just really quickly just talk about that. So I would encourage, so if you don't know who they are, I think probably many of you have heard of it. And they're not simply Keynesians on steroids or something. You see people dismissing them like that. They do have this unique perspective, and it is different from standard Keynesianism. In fact, Paul Krugman sort of went head to head against, their leader, and he lost in the sense of, among leftist progressives, it was clear that, the professional economists thought Krugman crushed him, but that's not the audience. In terms of like who's winning the hearts and minds among leftist progressives, it's these MMTers. Stephanie Kelton's one of their big names right now. And let me just explain a little bit about why that's happening, is because they're using accounting tautologies that befuddle people. And so if their critics come at them because they don't like their conclusion, if the critics come at them and just say, no, that's wrong, they end up looking foolish because the MMTers, they're doing sort of like a bait and switch or a Mott and Bailey, if you know that term. The MMTers are, where they'll say some things that are true in terms of accounting and then lead you to believe that, oh, and so what that means, therefore, is we can have a Green New Deal, or we can, have a basic, universal basic income and all these other programs, and it won't be painful because of these. So they're misleading. But I'm saying if you attack them directly, they fall back on these accounting tautologies. And so if people are unwise in their attacks, they end up looking like they don't know what they're talking about. So just real quick, for example, Stephanie Kelton said, look, I'm talking to a bunch of lawmakers. And I say, hey, would you think it would be a good idea if we could just snap our fingers and get rid of the federal debt? And they all say, oh, yes, that would be great. And then she says, and then I ask him a follow-up question and say, do you think it would be good if we snapped our fingers and all the retirement accounts and the hedge funds and all these institutional money managers and just regular savers around the world who are holding U.S. Treasury securities, if those assets all just disappeared, do you think that would be good for the global economy? And they all say, oh no, that would be a disaster. That would be, that'd be a global depression. And then Stephanie Kelton says, well, those two things are the exact same thing. The U.S. debt, from the federal government's point of view, is the treasury securities that are assets to all of these, institutional money managers and retirement accounts and blah, 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 including, among U.S. retirees around the world. Those are their assets. The federal government owes money to all these people holding those things, and they think that is the safest fixed income asset in the world. And so you obviously are speaking nonsense if you think the first thing would be great and the second thing would be Armageddon. Okay, so I'm just saying that, and I believe, she's telling this anecdote, and I believe her that happened because people would get tripped up like that. So that's kind of the danger, is just be careful if you ever try to like argue with these MMT people online, is because they can be slippery, and they know their own, like their little book. They understand their dogma, and so if you've never waded into that, your instincts are going to say no, they're speaking nonsense, because their conclusion is if the federal government borrows more money, it makes everybody have more savings, and your spidey sense is going off, and something's screwy with that claim. But it's not that it's wrong mathematically. It's just when you parse down what they're saying, it doesn't have the same implication as what they're trying to get you to think. So I'll just go one more minute here, and then I'll field your guys' questions. So on that, like to break down a little bit, just to give you a hint, and obviously you can look up my name, Google it with MMT, and you can see I can spell this out if you've never heard me go through this stuff before. But the idea is, there's a fundamental difference between like a company having a bond that a private firm issued as an asset to say like, oh yeah, GE needed to borrow money. I lent them $1 million. And so I have a bond from GE and they owe me $1.1 million next year. Because how is GE going to pay you back? They're going to have to provide goods and services to their customers, above and beyond their cost of production in order to come up with the money to pay you back that, what they owe you. So that being your asset is kind of socially fine. Whereas if the federal government owes you a bunch of money, how are they going to come up with it, right? Like if Americans collectively in their retirement accounts are owed $20 trillion from the U.S. federal government, to say, oh, that's our asset. How are we going to get that? Well, the federal government's either just going to print it up or point guns at everybody and take it through taxes, right? So if some guy owed you $100 and you knew the way he was going to pay you back was stick a gun in your belly and make you give him $100 out of your wallet, and then he'd say, oh, here's the $100 I owe you. That IOU from that guy really wouldn't be an asset the same way if you had an IOU from somebody else who wasn't going to rob you to pay it back, right? So I'm saying there's a qualitative difference there, but yet in terms of just the basic accounting, yes, the federal government's debt does correspond to the private sector's assets. And so I'm just warning you, if you try to like go toe to toe with these MMT people, you might get tripped up if you're not careful and understand like what their claim is. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'm happy to field your guys' questions.
Oh. Where do I speak? Get in front of it. Look the owl in the eyes. Look the owl in the eyes. Hello, Dr. Murphy. All right, I want this collapse to happen. Okay, of the economy. However, with $30 trillion in debt, about 5% of that is 1.5 trillion. If we have 3% inflation and 2% real growth in GDP, can't we run a $1.5 trillion deficit forever and this sustain itself? And of course, that makes me think, how the hell does Japan get up to 240 or 250% of debt to GDP ratio? I mean, that's the canary in the coal mine for me. But tell me, how does this collapse, and are we, how do we get there?
Okay, great. Yeah, great. So yes, a few different strands there. So yes, you're right. So it used to be like back in the 1950s, let's say, that the Keynesians would talk about having a balanced budget over the course of the business cycle. I forget the exact term they used. And so the idea was they were saying, oh, it's not that we want perpetual deficits. It's just like during a recession, run a big deficit, to prime the pump. And then during the good times, the boom period, the government should run a surplus to pay down the debt so that over the whole business cycle, we have a balanced budget, and that's fine. Okay. And then they moved beyond that, though, like going back to what the questioner was asking there, that nowadays, if you talk to a standard Keynesian and say, geez, the federal government's run up a big debt here, that's kind of unsustainable shit. And they'll pull out a piece of paper and just kind of go through some quick calculations and show you that, well no, like it could stabilize, and it can be the case, again, as the questioner was pointing out, that the U.S. debt to GDP ratio could stabilize, and you could have perpetually the government borrowing money, not just in absolute dollar terms, but even as a percent of the economy forever. And it would just stabilize. Okay. So if if that doesn't sound right to you, just when you go home or something, play around with a calculator, and you can see that it actually does make sense. Okay. And again, it's because if the U.S., depending on how fast the U.S. economy is growing, what the interest rate is in the debt and so forth, that it's fine that, the debt itself can be growing exponentially, so long as the underlying GDP is growing exponentially too, and it can all work out where nothing happened. But I'm saying right now, that's not the situation the U.S. is in, right? That according to the CBO's projections, it's not that the U.S. debt to GDP stabilizes anytime soon. If you go look at it, it just keeps mushrooming upward. All right. And then part of what's going to happen in terms of a negative feedback cycle is, I think, because right now interest rates are, yields on U.S. debt are still fairly low. It's still considered the safest asset in the world. And the more they pile on debt, I think investors are going to stop thinking that as much. So they're going to insist on higher interest rates in order to hold so much more debt, because the chance of default gets higher and higher. And then it's sort of a downward spiral. So it's a kind of thing where until it happens, it's fine. And then once people start losing confidence, it unravels really quickly. So is that going to happen next Thursday? Probably not. But is it going to happen, within the next 20 years? I think so. And then I guess he related it to Japan. So yeah, it is true. Just full disclosure, the Japanese economy, they have been running deficits, running up massive debt, like relative to the size of their economy for decades. And they obviously, it's not that the Japanese economy has imploded, or that, the yen has crashed, or that people around the world. So, I mean, I can give you some cultural factors. Ultimately, all this stuff goes back to, confidence. And the Japanese have such a high savings rate, and they're very conservative. And so people believe that, oh yeah, I would trust the Japanese central bank and their government with a given debt to GDP ratio more than I would trust like the government of Bolivia. Okay. And so there is that built into the system. And I guess I would just say with the US, I don't think the U.S. has the same credibility once they see stuff mushrooming out of control. Okay, but even in the case of Japan, it's not like their economy has been great. It's funny that like a lot of Keynesians would point to them and say, look, they've been trying to do this stuff for 20 years, and that still hasn't, and they haven't collapsed yet. But that also kind of proves the opposite. These policies of very low interest rates, massive QE, huge deficits, obviously hasn't jump-started the Japanese economy either. But you're right. They have remained in a limbo state for a while that you might have thought it couldn't have lasted that long. And investors keep, extending their rope, as it were.
Hi.
Hey.
Is there an argument to be made on like the Keynesian side? Could they say that like if there's some sort of technological revolution or something that like could potentially jumpstart the GDP, would that help? Like, could that potentially happen, right? Something happens where it's like industrial revolution level change that could jumpstart it. AI. Like AI, exactly, yeah. Right?
Okay, yeah, great, great question, and yes, for the gentleman who chimed in there, I agree. AI. So yeah, so I'm in a bit of an awkward spot here because I've been doom and gloom. By the way, I'm not a perma bear. When Trump was first elected, and not because I'm like a huge Donald Trump fan or anything, but just I thought his economic policies were going to be a lot better than Hillary Clinton's. And that was the one time there was like a brief 2-month window where I was giving public talks, and some people came up and said, Bob, I've never seen you smile in public before. This is amazing. So it's not that I'm always pessimistic. It's just objectively, I think the situation's pretty bad. So I will say more recently, I have been on the AI bandwagon. And I would just tell you guys, if like you thought it was a fad, or let me put it to you this way. If you've only seen people posting tweets of like things they've done in terms of Chat GPT, or if you tried it a couple times and you went, you like asked it like write me a funny joke, or, write me an Eminem song in the style of Smithers from The Simpsons or something. And you just did a one-off thing and you saw the output. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's clever or whatever. That's not really where it shines. It's if you have like a problem you're working on and you needed someone to help you work through it, and you literally have a conversation with the thing. If you've never tried that, I encourage you to do it. It is amazing. I know how the stuff works, like how they program those things, and I can't believe that it works. Like I will wrap this up here because I don't want to go off on a huge tangent and eat the time. But it actually makes me think there's like information embedded in the structure of language that we don't realize or something, because with the training they've given these things, their ability to, because all they're doing is like doing the probabilities and saying what's the next most likely, they call it a token. It's like a word to produce. And that's all they're really doing under the hood. And the conversations, and there's no other word to use except conversations you have with them, are incredible at this point, right? They keep getting better. So even if you tried it like 6 months ago, I'm telling you, it's better now than it was 6 months ago. So anyway, having said all that, yeah, I've been saying for a while that is going to revolutionize the economy, but adoption is surprisingly slow. So even when I'm talking to people like other CEOs, and the company I work with right now, Infinio, we have a big AI branch. Okay, so I think we're, in terms of my day job, I'm working with this stuff day in and day out, and we talk to other people in the industry too. So everybody kind of knows, yeah, this is going to change the world, but even the adoption among true believers is surprisingly slow, because you kind of got to sit there and say, well, how do we? Let me put it this way: it's sort of like if you had a bunch of workers who have an IQ of, let's say, 110, just to pull a number out of the air, and they could work for 30 cents an hour. And if you like, they have to telecommute. They can't come to the office and like move boxes around because they don't have bodies. But if they had that level of intelligence for many tasks, and if so, jobs that you could get a telecommuting worker to do at your company, and you got to pay them, let's say $1 an hour, let's say all told, could you use that? And there's an infinite supply. Well, you see what I'm saying? So like that's in a sense what we were tapping into here. So I think, yeah, 10 years from now, as more companies figure out how to use that, it's going to change things tremendously, but it's going to take time to get there. So my point was, the irony, Brandy, was I've been real pessimistic for a long time, that like the yield curve has been deeply inverted, if you guys know what that is. So there's lots of standard recession indicators that are flashing alarm bells. But at the same time, I've been writing more and more about, it looks like AI is going to greatly enhance human productivity in terms of like how much stuff can planet Earth be cranking out per month pretty soon. And so, the two. So I think there still is going to be a crash like in the next, 2 years, let's say. But I think more like 5 to 10 years in the future, we're really going to see the impact of all this AI development and enhancement.
Kind of on topic, in 10, 20, 30 years, if, this AI revolution kind of comes into play, there's a lot of possibilities on what the capabilities are. So kind of a fun question, but like if you have like these self-replicating humanoid robot type of level of production, like what do you think should be the libertarian position on money if they start mining asteroids and they bring a bunch of gold back? Do we have anywhere to go in that scenario? It doesn't seem all that unrealistic in say 30 years. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts would be if it's no longer a scarce resource.
Right. Great. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So that was what I wrote about Bitcoin, back in when I first started writing on Bitcoin. I think my thing came out, and I co-wrote a guide to that in like 2013. If you've never seen it, it still, I think, holds up. It's understandingbitcoin.us is where it's a free PDF just to go through like some of these basic issues. So yeah, that's what I argued at that point. I said there's a sense in which Bitcoin is even a harder money than gold or silver, because it really is capped at 21 million, whereas gold and silver, as you say, in theory, like yeah, we could go get an asteroid or something, and if they could redirect it or go make it come close to Earth, or they could just go get it and bring it back, or even if those of you who watch like Star Trek: The Next Generation, and they have like the replicators, you go up to make me a cup of Earl Grey tea, and it just kind of it appears inside the thing. Once they get to the point where they have technology, they can just rearrange atoms or even things at the subatomic level and just create matter that way, by taking other matter and rearranging its constituents. obviously any money that's based in terms of physical stuff, you know, that the scarcity there goes out the window. So in that sense, yeah, I think if they do get to that point, then yeah, the money would have to be something that, I mean, it might not be Bitcoin, maybe something else would come along that humans at that point realize, you know, does the job better. But I can see how that might have to be the case. So I'm not saying right now that Bitcoin's a better money. I'm just saying that is one attribute it has that gold and silver, you know, that's a potential weakness that they have.
Oh, all right. So quick question for you. So obviously, America needs to hear this message on the collapsing economy now more than probably ever. And the messengers for this campaign should be largely the Libertarian Party. We should be carrying a message like this across the country on a mass scale. So my question to you is, would you consider running for vice president under the Libertarian Party banner to promote this message?
No. Yeah, so thank you for, I appreciate it. Yeah, there was a while ago, some people really tried to get me, and I think Tom Woods at the time too, like this, like on one of the Contra cruises, there was a real hard put. And with me, it's, I got little kids. I can't, I mean, you guys saw, I couldn't even get out to give you guys a talk today. I couldn't do it. It wouldn't be worth it. Also, I don't like asking people for money. Like, so just, I'm not good at fundraising. So those are two big strikes. What I am up for though, is anybody who's running, if I like supported them, I would totally be happy to write a more like realistic, you know, economic plan, or so, you know what I mean? Like obviously you can't just campaign and say, oh, get rid of the Fed and just get rid of all taxes and we have a voluntary society the Tuesday after I'm elected, and that's what my plan is. Like, it just doesn't sound realistic, so I get it. So in terms of like, you know, privatizing federal land, and I've written some specific things, or, you know, cutting income tax rates, getting a flat tax, things like that, you know, various candidates, if they wanted something that, you know, was defensible, that was made of real numbers, that somebody else could argue with, you know, that was a plausible thing to say, like, we could really do this, this could happen. You know, I'm happy to work on stuff like that, but yeah, not me being the candidate. No, it's with my personal situation.
Question, it's always no. Hey, Bob, thanks for talking today.
Yeah.
I want to ask a silly question, which is from comparing digital currency to gold, is it a false concern to be thinking about the fact that digital currency relies on electricity and computing power in the zombie apocalypse?
Right. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so that's, you know, again, that's why I was trying to make sure I wasn't coming off 5 minutes ago in response to the other guy's question. I'm not here saying like, yep, Bitcoin's the future and gold and silver are done. That's not what I was saying. I was just saying, though, if you assess like their pluses and minuses, you know, that those are factors. And so, yeah, an obvious virtue for physical commodity money like gold or silver is just what you said. So like, for example, me personally, like if I'm talking to people in my personal life and where just that are thinking like me, I tell them, you know what would be great to have, in addition to having bottled water and ammunition and stuff like that, if that's what up your alley, that's the kind of thing you want to do, is having a bunch of, you know, what's called junk silver, like quarters that were issued before the 1960s. So they have silver content, because if you're in the zombie apocalypse and you're dealing with somebody who grew up in the United States, you can give them a quarter that was, you know, made in 1950 and say, go Google that. You know, they can tell what it is and they can go look it up and see what the silver content is, right? Whereas if it's like a foreign coin that you know has gold content or silver content, but, you know, some guy who isn't into precious metals doesn't know what the heck it is. You know, some kid that was a cashier at the grocery store before society collapsed, whereas they know what a U.S. quarter looks like, and you can tell them to go look it up, right? So, well, I guess if there's no electricity, they can't look it up, but they do know what a U.S. quarter looks like, right? So that's the kind of thing that, yeah, I think for just that purpose, that ultimately I think the real solution is to be diversified. Obviously, that's common sense, but yeah, right, that in a situation like that, you could have a bunch of Bitcoin and it's still on the blockchain, right? It's once the computers get up and running again, someone's gonna reboot those files, and they're going to remember, the network's going to get restored eventually, maybe patchwork around the globe. But yeah, in the meantime, or if you're in an area where there is no Wi-Fi, that's going to be tricky. You're not going to be able to use that, even though you may have plenty of Satoshis stashed somewhere.
Another question. I'm sorry, Bob. I'm gonna steal all your time. That's why I asked you to come. I just wanted to talk to you. So the other question I had was, what do you think that the Libertarian Party, or even just like as candidates, what do you think that the top 2 to 3 issues economically, like succinctly, like what do you think that we should be focusing on?
I still think, just focusing on the Federal Reserve is a great one. I mean, because it's relevant. I mean, it's not just like, oh, what's going to resonate with people more. Like it is relevant. And here I had been totally wrong. So when Ron Paul, first ran as a Republican, in the 2008 cycle, I thought he made a strategic mistake. When I first saw him talking about the Fed, I said, no, I've been a college professor. I've tried to teach, what's called open market operations, how, and the Federal Reserve buys bonds and then that injects base money and then the bank, and it just, puts people to sleep. Kids don't get, I thought focus on, bringing the troops home and legalizing marijuana. That's what I thought would and there wasn't. He focused on, end the Fed and got young kids chanting that. So it proved me wrong. So I still think that's the main thing to focus on, because I think it resonates around the board that leftist progressive types, like when I was in Nashville, we went, some local people said, hey, we're going to go do a protest outside there's not like a Federal Reserve Bank, but there was like the branch that's in Nashville. And we went to do that, and there were like a lot of leftist types there who were holding up signs, as the motorist driving by, thinking like, what the heck are these guys doing with these bullhorns, saying the Federal Reserve is privately owned and stuff like, which, to me, that's not a bad thing, right? Like I love private ownership, right? But I understand why, if you're like a leftist progressive and you hear that sounds crazy, right? Like if you heard the FDA was literally owned by the pharmaceutical companies, right? Like there's stuff going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of money going around, and you could say, oh, it basically is bought and sold. But I mean, if it were literally, if Pfizer was a shareholder in the FDA, that would be next level. And yet that's literally what happens with the Fed, that the banks literally are shareholders of the Fed, right? So that is a weird thing. And so I think it kind of cuts across the spectrum in terms of where people are coming from, and they realize that's screwy. Whatever it is they want to replace it with. Like, so even the MMT types and whatever, a lot of them think it's crazy the way our current system works, where the federal government issues bonds to private broker dealers who then sell it to the Fed, right? The Fed can't directly buy bonds from the Treasury. That's illegal, but it's a big shell game. That's effectively what's happening, but yet you can't, right? So everybody realizes the current system is all smoke and mirrors. It's just, what they want to do as a replacement depends on your ideology. So to answer your question, I think the focusing on the Fed, because that also enables all the wars and everything, right? So whatever your issue is, the central bank provides the fuel for all that stuff. And so if you got rid of that, or at least greatly, handcuffed it, that would certainly limit the other things. And then besides that, I do think just, saying that the economy is not, there's going to be a crash, to try to get that message out, partly just so people can prepare. And I would say to you guys too, that like, besides just figuring out what assets do I want to own, try to get multiple streams of income going. If you just have one job right now, I would really encourage you brainstorm and figure out, is there something else I can get going on the side? Because you don't want to be doing that if a crash happens and then everybody else is out of work too. That's not when you want to start your side business. So I would just, so that when the crash does happen, assuming I'm not nuts, then some people will at least remember, oh yeah, that one guy, I thought he was kind of a paranoid nut job at the time, but he was right. And certainly we don't want it to be able to be blamed on laissez-faire capitalism.
So I wanted to bring up, like last year you had that, the Silicon Valley Bank failed. I think there was a couple banks that failed. I don't know all the details, but I guess like last Monday, there was something with like the Fed discount window it got reduced or discontinued, and people are thinking there might be some more bank mergers in the future. Do you recommend putting your money in larger banks and staying away from small ones, or having mattress money? Is there anything that you're concerned about it, or can you speak to that, those bank failures?
Okay, sure. So yeah, I mean, in general, I don't think the banking system is sound at all. And, the work we do at Infinio, if you want to go check it out, we give people alternatives, that kind of stuff. But beyond that, right, given that you're going to have money in a checking account somewhere, yeah, I think it is other things equal. If you got some, you like your local bank, I'm not saying your bank's going to fail next Tuesday if you're in a regional bank. I'm not saying that. But yeah, over time, I think there's going to be more consolidation. And especially, yeah, after SVB went down, there was a huge amount of consolidation. Because people sort of read the writing on the wall and realized in terms of like the Fed's implicit backstops that they just felt, yeah, like, the cliche of too big to fail, that the Fed's not going to allow these monster banks to go down, whereas the regional ones are the ones more likely that if something happens, they get held up for a while. So ultimately, until the whole system goes down, your money's probably going to be okay. And again, not because they're doing such wise management, because they can just print money, but it's still inconvenient, right? That it's still, if your bank closes temporarily while it's getting taken over and they're doing a merger or something to get it subsumed into a larger one, you might not have access to your money for a few weeks while that's getting all sorted out. So to avoid that kind of headache and so forth, yeah, a lot of people, I think, correctly looked 2 moves ahead and said, you know what, I'm going to just move my stuff into the larger banks, and all that makes sense. Like, so the cynics were saying that yes, the bankers, used the scare in order to consolidate their power, and this is also why, like, in terms of if somebody was interested, like the CBDC issue, I don't think anytime soon there's going to literally just be one, Fed coin or something, or they might even just be the dollar, and everybody directly has a checking account, like every citizen with the Federal Reserve. I don't think that's going to happen, just because that would sweep away all the power of like the intermediate layers of banks, like private banks, commercial banks. And again, they literally own the Fed. So I don't think they would be voting themselves out of existence. But I think what you could see is sort of a hybrid that's kind of the same thing, where there's a lot of consolidation, the number of banks keeps shrinking, and then they're all like one giant cartel that all kind of have the same playbook. And so, yes, it's not literally everyone just banks with the Fed and the central bank knows every purchase you made. But if it's the Fed directly interfaces with 20 giant banks, and every US citizen has a checking account with one of those 20 banks, and they all pass information to the Fed, that's kind of the same thing. So I think that's more likely what we're going to see over time.
Will you sing us a song since you're missing karaoke?
I would. I got a cold. I'm gonna plead that I can't do it. I got an injury.
I think we're all set, Bob.
Okay, well, great. So thanks everybody. I'm glad to see the turnout, and just keep doing what you're doing, guys. Sorry I couldn't be there.
We love you.